Hello again. I slightly changed the title of my talk. I hope it's okay. I'm going to approach publishing as a support for preserving art and media art in particular. My intention is not to think of it as a replacement for already well-established conservation methods and strategies, but unfold its potential to open up for different ways to think about these approaches, and more broadly to think about preservation and its purpose and its role. Installations only exist when installed. For those involved with time-based media conservation, this statement may be familiar. It may sound self-evident, but this is really a ground on which a distinction between traditional and a lot of current art is made in conservation research. We can take this work as an example, entitled News. This installation by Hans Hake continuously prints out headlines from world news agencies and so forms a fragile sculpture that audiences will come to inspect. Literally, all you see, every single tangible component, including printer and paper and table and text on the paper, is replaceable. Its appearance is negotiated on the occasion of its every new exhibition. And throughout the lifespan of this work, since it was first made in 1969, these elements have indeed changed many times. Other installations may contain sculpture elements which need to be stored and subjected to standard preservation procedures, but non-dedicated components, such as all these, can be usually recycled for other works or discarded. Unlike more or less static, self-contained art objects, such as painting and sculpture, installations, and even more so media installations, cease to exist after exhibition. They disappear with the end of the exhibition, not just for the general public, but for curators and conservators and other staff. But of course, media works not only disappear with the installation, but they can expire when one of its underlying technical systems is rendered obsolete. Take this web-based performance work by Janet Cardiff. Eyes of Laura was commissioned and acquired by Vancouver Art Gallery in 2004. The piece consisted of a weblog presented as written by a security guard who is observing daily happenings on a square nearby the museum. Next to this diary, the website showed live images of the square taken by a surveillance camera installed on the roof of the building. While blog posts were performed by instructed museum staff and the work had been set to remain installed for an indefinite period, it had ceased to operate when underlying technologies of Java and then eventually also QuickTime and Flash ceased to be supported by standard browsers. So what does it mean for collection? How to make sure a work can be brought to life again? The standard answer is documentation. The lives of installations rely on documentation, and the ideal time to produce it is in the process of setting them up for exhibition. Both of these cases illustrate well the many aspects that need to be understood and recorded. There is a spatial arrangement of components, there is temporality, there is an aging technology, there is software, data, sound, there is audience interaction, there is material fragility, there are substantial needs for maintenance during exhibition, and also social cultural context, and therefore meaning and agency of the work are quickly changing as well. And the artists may still be around to have a say over their current preferences for displaying their work. So reality looks something like this. Documents are spread across various systems and folders and departments, and their systems are hardly compatible, and members of staff have hardly access to all branches of these trees and rhizomes. These illustrations are from a large art museum, but the situation is not necessarily different for small collections, but also for artists and studios. So what are the ways to make documentation usable? How to organize it? I talked about the case of SM-MoMA MediaWiki at this conference 2 years ago. To sum up just briefly, the museum had first began to arrange documents for each installation in dedicated physical binders. But due to practical issues, it shifted attention to web-based platform used by Wikipedia called MediaWiki. The museum's interdisciplinary team, meeting regularly around the issues with time-based media, spearheaded adoption of this tool as a way to bring together various strands of documentation from various members of staff across departments in one place. This wiki is accessible to staff, and all of its users are also contributors. I interpreted this platform as something novel in a conservation landscape. It's an example of support of the standard use of collection management systems by a content management system. A wiki is really a publishing tool where contributors are editors. And my presentation has turned into an article where I discuss it at length, and it's available in open access online. This approach can work inside a museum, and its adoption can indeed challenge and change institutions from within. It could spark collaboration across departments and professions. But while it helps to keep works alive in its institutional memory, it doesn't leave its walls. It is kept inside. There has been a lot of talk about the importance of relating the work of conservators and maintainers to public. So my question is, how can we pursue preservation documentation as a public-facing work in itself? One very notable initiative in this regard has been the International Network for Conservation of Contemporary Art, INCA, which emerged in the late 90s out of the Netherlands, bringing together museums such as Van Abbe and Tate and Guggenheim and SMAG and MUMOC and others. And the network established a shared online database for gathering documentation and research material about their collections. During the 2000s, they gathered hundreds of artist interviews and reports and guidelines and other documents in it. However, concerns about confidentiality restricted access to network members and also limited the vast majority of included documents to metadata. So in past many years, the database is no longer a primary activity of Inca platform. That is now a place for sharing news, announcements, and publications from the field, and does it well. So while the project was a major initiative to share conservation documentation among experts in a semi-public setting, in retrospect, its primary success seemed to be to enable networking among members and access to designs of templates and reports. These roles were critical before the proliferation of contemporary art conservation conferences and scholarly publishing. I have an article coming up in a book by Naka where I discuss many more aspects of this initiative. So if the database proved to be a too tedious medium to record and share documentation, what are the other means to do so? The Inca network undertook another large-scale research project called Inside Installations. In the span of several years, participating museums and other initiatives studied the issues stemming from preserving and exhibiting changing installations. They undertook more than 30 case studies, restaging was recorded in detail in a digital repository on a public website that has quickly become sought after reference. The website format afforded contributors to go into deeper detail and build a resource around artist profiles and case studies. They are presented in often self-reflective way, with the person of conservator present in the narrative, articulating dilemmas and weighing their options. In addition, the cases serve to develop and test new models of documentation. This has been by far a sole publication detailing dilemmas in preserving contemporary artworks. In what follows, I offer a brief review of several notable research publications and draw some conclusions. Inca was preceded by a large research project in the second half of the 90s. Here, a working group of Dutch art museums studied a range of modern artworks posing challenges to conservation. Their efforts set the ground for and were discussed as part of a large conference entitled Modern Art, Who Cares? And their case studies appeared in the resulting publication. In fact, the book set a precedent for case study approach to talk publicly about dilemmas and decision-making in preserving works of living artists. While the large-scale effort in the case of Inca database has been limited to restricted access and metadata due to confidentiality and fears of criticism from the side of artists and their representatives, In the case of both modern art bouquets and inside installations, the materials were cleared for publication. They assumed primarily essayistic form, even though language and stylistics are clearly indebted to the daily practice of writing reports. Still, they provided authorial and polyvocal accounts on behind the stages of installing art. We can recount several other research projects with similar aims and methods. The influential Variable Media Network, another museum consortium founded by Guggenheim and Langlois Foundation, focused on preserving media art. The case studies were selected in order to tackle as broad-scale problems as possible. The overall aim was to develop a conceptual framework for preserving these works. The documentation presented on the project website, which continues to be available to this day, is designed with this in mind. Following a brief curatorial and technical narrative about each work, there is a section in which this method, Variable Media Questionnaire, is applied to every work. The Langlois Foundation was involved in another research project on preserving media art as part of a consortium of Canadian art museums. The DOCAM Alliance was in a way a follow-up to Variable Media and built a somewhat richer resource. 18 case studies were chosen to develop best practices guide for cataloging and conservation. Again, cases were selected to illustrate different problems, and some of them were installed also in the process. I will mention one more project designed along similar lines with a focus on digital art. A museum consortium spearheaded by ZKM similarly aimed to provide a comprehensive catalog of problems and develop a documentation model which, while restaging works, this time for a traveling exhibition. The online publication is very modest when it comes to conservation details, but the printed book offers a well-researched personal accounts of reinstalling 10 artworks, accompanied by interviews with artists such as Jody and Jeffrey Shaw, etc. So to sum up, projects such as these select artworks to engage with different conservation problems and are framed by a general aim to develop more general models from various perspectives, whether it is installation, media, or digital art. It has to be said that the resulting models have been rarely closely adopted. Rather, the ambitions to create them served primarily as vehicles to generalize particular problems and focus on commonalities among very different works. We can note it, for example, in a Variable Media project where the notion of performed works ended up being applied not only to performance art, but also to installations such as Meg Webster's Stick Spiral, where museum staff is instructed on how to complete the work. We can say that the resulting publications brought together scholarly research and documentation, specifically artist interviews, and were generally aimed at expert audiences. But while they mostly talk expert language, they have pioneered making more accessible the labor and negotiations happening behind the walls of the institution. So I will talk about several other more recent publications whose target audience is potentially broader, including also examples aimed at the general public. Specifically, I will identify some of the new aspects they have brought about. So the Getty Foundation's online scholarly catalog initiative was launched in 2009 to create models for the scholarly publication of museum collection catalogs online. Perhaps the most significant among them is Rauschenberg Research Project, conducted by SF MoMA on Rauschenberg's almost 90 works in the museum's collection. The online publication is designed as a catalog indeed, with a range of materials surrounding his works, including newly commissioned essays and images and video interviews, artist statements, conservation reports, and archival materials. The included works can be seen as traditional from the perspective of changing artworks, as their preservation mainly engages with material stability. However, in its scope of opening up museum vaults, it is quite unprecedented. Another collection-based research, which has been designed as a scholarly extension of collection catalog, is Tate's In Focus. In Focus is a long-term, open-ended editorial work managed by Tate's collection research department. Artworks dossiers can be viewed as self-contained publications on their own, comprising essays in which invited specialists explore various aspects of the work's making and history in depth, somewhat like in commission essays for exhibition catalogs. They draw on Tate's own research resources and feature materials found in conservation files, gallery records, and archive. The Artist Archives project, initiated by Glenn Ward and Dina Engel, is a resource intended to aid curators and conservators and others to research works of selected artists. The first iteration is dedicated to David Wojnarowicz, deriving from his archive at NYU. Currently, they work on another one with John Jones. The editors collect information intended for future exhibitions and conservation interventions and writing about the artist's work. So while Rauschenberg Project and In Focus are designed as sections of their own museum websites, Artist Archives is a self-contained media wiki page. I have two more examples. The aim of a net art anthology created by New York-based Rhizome has been to bring attention to net-based works. The publication is a self-contained website with subpages dedicated to 100 selected artworks. Rather than following a structured template, content in the entries is divided into blocks and arranged to present a linear narrative, which is primarily based on a selected article on the work by an art critic and complemented from other sources. The narrative stands out from other similar publications. It is an easy read, cleverly combining historical, technical, and preservation context of the work in what can be seen as an artwork's wall label in the age of Twitter. For Rhizome's director, Michael Connor, this project is about storytelling. The form of the works, which are primarily net-based, allow them to also present them in an online exhibition as individual restagings, accessible inside the browser through emulations. So unlike the previous three examples, this anthology has been accompanied by an exhibition of some of the works. Back to Lima. So partly inspired by Rhizome's anthology, but responding to the situation of digital art in the Netherlands, Lima has launched what can be described as a preservation lobby. Like Rhizome, Lima is not a museum, but it does maintain a catalog of media artworks ever since the 80s. With this project, it has focused on the part of the field still underrepresented in Dutch museum collections that are still accustomed to associate media art with video. This was one of the starting points to provide museums with an entry point to digital art, which they decided to entitle Digital Canon. With a team of curators and historians, I think including Anne Dekker sitting here, Lima has created and released a long list of historical works, and out of them selected 20 works and produced documentary entries on a dedicated website. The entries put emphasis on a technical narrative. They can't be taken as an online exhibition, as the majority of works does have dedicated components, even though, interestingly, net-based works are presented as screencasts. As project director Gabe Weyers said, bringing these works into attention is also a preservation strategy. It is a perfect way to reconnect with new technologies and also with new audiences. Lima has started to work with academies to take this canon as case studies to discuss the history of digital art. Next to this work, a gallery exhibition is in the making as well, and it is expected to further shape this resource. So in comparison to first few examples, these more recent publications present works in broader contexts, where the discussions of conservation and preservation dilemmas are complemented by polyvocal perspectives on historical and contemporary significance of the works. While the former analyze artworks as case studies, as vehicles for theoretical questions, these latter publications are more focused on the presentation aspect, employing conservation research to enrich transmission of artworks through publishing. By doing this, they target both expert and general audience. Obviously, every project stands on its own and is obviously shaped by a complex set of intentions and ambitions and limitations. But for the purpose of this analysis, I would suggest to view them as bringing together the historical trajectories of two distinct forms, that of a scholarly monograph and a collection catalog. On the one hand, central to scholarly research is analysis and synthesis, learning and production of knowledge. Collection catalogs, on the other hand, along with their ecosystems of information space, inventorize and document collections over time and provide various access points for both staff and public. I will conclude by suggesting that a research catalog, building upon these two traditions, could help keep installations and other artworks in collective memory. Recent research publications show us that it is possible to solve privacy and confidentiality issues standing in the way of talking about conservation more openly. We can view the act of publishing preservation not only as revealing floor plans and long lists and exhibition histories, but more broadly as bringing to spotlight the labor involved in producing, creating, installing, and conserving artworks, along with negotiations and decision-making involved in this work. It is view of preservation and conservation as humanities, as with their commitment to interpretation, to embracing ambiguity and uncertainty, contradiction and the lack of fixity and singularity. The aim here is not just to provide access to collection, but access to conditions making collections possible in the first place, its madeness and its constructedness. Ultimately, this work could contribute to dismantling of the myth of a sovereign artist and the myth of artwork as self-contained fixed entity and the myth of exhibition as a curatorial gesture. It could lay bare the complexity of this dynamic, ever-changing, negotiable entity that the artwork is. Thank you very much.